Hi students, today we are going to learn how to make a data table using Google Sheets and how to graph also using Google Sheets. But before we get started, I want to show you how we are going to organize our data when we import it into a Google Sheet. So this is actually going to be a little bit different than how you might intuitively organize a data table. So this data table on this side here, this is organized in the way that most people would set up a data table. I've got the day, I've got my plant A, and I'm going to record the height of it, and I've got my plant B, and I'm going to record the height of that, and then I'm able to see all my data from plant A and all my data from plant B. But this is not going to be super useful for being able to sort my data or being able to graph it using Sheets. So instead, we're going to use a format called tidy data, and we're going to switch our data tables from this style to this style. So here's how this style works. In tidy data, each column that we have is its own variable. So my variables with this experiment are the day that I do my measuring, which plant I'm measuring, and then the height that that plant is, which is what I'm actually measuring. So I've got three variables in this setup. Each of them has its own column. Now each row is going to be my independent observations. So on day 1, I would record plant A has its specific height, and on day 1, plant B has its specific height. It does not actually really matter how these are arranged because I can use Google Sheets to rearrange them depending on whether or not I want all of plant A's information together, or maybe I want all of day 1's information together. That's a pretty easy sorting function that I'll show you how to do. Now each cell contains a single value. We're not going to put multiple things into each cell. And I want you to notice that I'm also not putting the units into the cell. The cells are going to have just the numbers or just the words. They're not going to have numbers and letters. All right, let's look at some data and see how this works. So here's an example of some jumping bean data, and I made this up. So do not think that this in any way has to do with how jumping beans actually work. What I've got here is I've got 3 different beans, and I've color-coded those so that they're easy for you to see. But I've got 3 different beans. I changed the temperature, and I recorded the mass and the number of jumps per minute. Now, the reason that I've organized it like this, instead of organizing it with like bean 1 and then temperature 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees, like people normally would, is because I want to be able to sort this data. So instead of sorting it by the beans, all of the 1's together and all of the 2's together, maybe I want to sort it by the mass. So the way that I would do that is I would select all of my data here, and then I'm going to click at the top where I'm going to click Tools. Notice that I did not select that top row, my headers, so just be aware of that. I've just selected my numbers. When I click on, not Tools, it's Data. When I click on Data, I'm going to sort range, and then I'm going to choose what I want to sort by. So because each of my variables has its own column, I can just choose a whole column to sort by. In this case, mass is column C, and so I'm going to sort that, and as you can see now, it's sorted it so that the lowest mass is all together, and then the middle mass is all together, and the largest mass is all together. Likewise, I could organize it by temperature. Maybe I want all of the 5-degree temperatures together and all of the 10-degree temperatures together. So again, I would click Data, Sort Range. This time I'm going to sort by column B. So depending on what I want to see, I can actually change how this data is sorted. Now, I don't really like that, so I'm going to click Undo, put it back how it was. All right, now we need to see how to graph this data. So in order to graph the data, one of the easiest ways to do it is to simply highlight or select your entire dependent variable. So I've clicked on all the dependent variables, including the heading at the top. I'm now going to click this button right here, which is my Insert Chart button. Chart is what Google Sheets calls a graph. Now I'm going to move this graph over so that I can still see my data, because while I have my jumps per minute here, it's not sure what to use as my independent variable or my x-axis. In order to set my x-axis, I'm going to click on this space right here, and then this button here allows me to select the data from the table. So I'm going to click that, and now I want my temperature to be my independent variable. So I'm going to select all of that, including that heading, and click OK. So now I have my graph. It's not done, but it's a pretty good start. And what you'll notice is that because I had 3 beans for each temperature, I've got 3 dots on my graph for each temperature. Now, Google Sheets is pretty cool because they have this aggregate button. And this is going to make it so that I can find the aggregate of all of those data points. So I'm going to click it. I don't actually want the sum. I want the average. So now I have graphed the average for all 3 beans without having to do any math at all. And I think that's pretty cool. Now let's see how to set up the rest of our graph. In graphing, we are going to follow something called TAILS. Now, TAILS is an acronym, so I'm going to want my title, my axes, my interval, my labels, and my scale. That's what TAILS stands for. So let's click back into this graph and let's see if we can set these things up. Nope. So the first thing I want is my title. Now, your title needs to explain what I'm looking at, and jumps per minute doesn't really tell me anything. So this should explain your data. You can see that I'm just typing in for my title here, and it's going to change the title there. So explain your data, put whatever title you want. Next, I need to make sure that I have my axes. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to click on vertical axes and horizontal axes. My vertical axis is done, my horizontal axis is not. So now I'm going to go in here and I'm going to change this, and it is in temperature degrees Celsius. So I'm just going to put that in, and now I have my axes. Next is my interval. Well, because I did this on a computer, my interval is actually done for me. What you can see here is each of these points increases by the same amount. So my temperature is increasing by 5 each time. My number of jumps per minute is also increasing by 5 each time. So my interval is done for me. Labels is the next thing on my TAILS list. Labels is telling me that I need to have my axes labeled. So not just having the numbers here, but I need to actually have the axes labeled, and I need to include my units. So here I've got the units of Celsius and my units of jumps per minute. And then finally, I need the scale. Now, scale just means that everything needs to be evenly spaced and take up as much of the graph paper as we can. So we wouldn't want to have all of our data clustered at the top. That would mean we've got a bunch of wasted graph space down here. It's important to note that your graphs don't have to start at 0. They absolutely can, but they don't have to. And so your scale might need to shift in order to utilize your graph paper most effectively. Again, because I did this on the computer, I don't have to actually worry about scale because it's going to do it for me. All right, so now I have my graph. Let's see if we can graph another set of data. Excuse me. Okay, so I'm still going to have my jumps per minute as my independent variable. My dependent variable. So I'm still going to have jumps per minute as my dependent variable. But this time, I want to see if mass has an impact. So mass is going to be my independent variable. So here we go. We're going to click Chart. We're going to move this over so that I can still see the rest of my data. I'm going to change my x-axis by clicking this little symbol. I'm going to select all of the mass. That's now my independent variable. I'm going to move my graph back over so that I can see it. And now I have all of my data. Again, I'm going to want to aggregate it because I've got 5 different samples for each mass, but I'm going to want the average for those. And then I'm going to want to make sure that I have all of my title, axis, interval, labels, and scale. So by double clicking on where the title is, I can change my title. I can then change the chart title here to the horizontal axis, and I can type in whatever that is, making sure I include the units. And now I still have my interval done for me. My labels, I'm double checking that I've got those there, and my scale is done for me. So as you can see from this, based on the data that I made up, it doesn't look like mass really has that much of an effect. It might, but I don't know. This is unclear from this data. We would definitely want to collect more to see if there are any trends. All right, so that is how we graph. That is how we set up our data tables. When you're graphing, don't forget tails.